Welcome, everyone. This is episode 45 of the Brandon Adams podcast. I have with me Hugh Henry. Hugh, where does this afternoon find you?
You find me at the work site for my new villa, which I'm hoping to open by the end of the year. So you find me in St Barts, hot and humid St Barts.
How is business this time of year?
Well, this is the low season. High season in St Barts is the Northern Hemisphere winter. Um, the summer is hot and sticky, and the best place in the world to be is the Mediterranean, and supposedly others, but the Mediterranean. Um, but yeah, the island is kind of this year has been dope, has been insane. Everyone is still trying to get COVID out of their system. Everyone's kind of still feels they owe themselves a good time, and this is a good time place.
Well, I enjoyed yesterday catching up on your recent podcast with Ben Hunt, and both of you admit to a bit of a pessimism bias. I admit to one myself, and the pessimism bias is severe enough that in Ben Hunt's case, he's on a farm in the Northeast, and in your case, you're in St. Barts. Um, does St. Barts feel independent? Are you prepared for many future states of the world?
I committed to here. My first purchase was at the end of 2012. But I kind of committed a longer term um, view of the world starting around about 2015. After the travails of the great financial crisis, having spent kind of 2 years being a what would I want to say? A clergyman, is that the right word? But almost being a minister of the cloth and sending everyone to wishing to send everyone to damnation. Um, I then got very tired by the helplessness of the situation, something which we see writ large. I'm sure we might touch upon it with the comedy of tragic errors, which is Europe, and this appalling elite governing class, which is not distinct to Europe. Clearly, it's alive and thriving in America as well. And I guess I was somewhat pessimistic in that I just don't know how you fix it. And if you can't fix it, you've got to kind of push and create a bit of a distance between you and them. And so this beautiful but kind of tiny volcanic island, which is semi-autonomous to the French state, um, and more than that, which is beautiful. There's a notion of the beauty in nature provides, I think the psychological term is soft focus. It provides healing. There's something just nice about music or about seeing beautiful white beaches. Here I'm surrounded by beautiful kind of wild, savage countryside. And it's healing. I mean, I like to say I kind of, part of me died in active financial combat over the I don't know, the 25 years or so leading up to 2017. I needed healing. And so this has been a source of that. Latterly, I feel a bit like the Last Jedi on this kind of rocky outcrop sent to just deliberate. Um, and maybe at some point, some, wonderfully inspiring young future Jedi will come and seek my wisdom and invite me back into the crazy other world. That it would seem that you're in Miami, and if you're out there in Vegas and whatever, I guess you're at the coal pit. You see the world and all the horrors unfolding every day. I'm in a bubble.
In terms of your information consumption, are you a podcast person? Are you reading a lot of books there? I'm sure you have interesting guests that pass by. What is your information diet looking like right now?
Is a question which fascinates me. I read on Kindle, which people take umbrage with, because without a doubt, there's a nobility and the texture and just the kind of kinetic energy from having a book in your hands and pages. But the Kindle is a wonderful invention for, well, reading is a wonderful invention. You can't just be creative. You got to work at it. And one of the, by far the best means of being creative is reading. And reading anything, reading romantic novels. I mean, not necessarily, God forbid, you're reading economic text and how to make money books. But reading is, you're putting yourself into the position of the characters and you're making the decisions of their journey almost before they make them, and then you're critiquing it. But you're kind of, so you're actually using the faculty of your mind, the process of discovery and how you react. And I find that is of great assistance when I come back and kind of focus on things with regard to markets and Fed policies and these macro issues about currencies and the state of the world. But I read very slowly. And unfortunately, I can't do the audio. Audio just sends me asleep. I've got a great friend who's got a meditation app, and he was like, oh, it's the best thing. I put it on and I fall asleep. And I was like, how do I break it to you? That sleeping is wonderful, but it's not meditation. You know, it's something else. So the audio doesn't work for me. I read very slowly. But the ability to capture, for me, it's reading is conscious REM. It's being alive, and the subconscious processing can actually be resolved as you read. And so for me, it's the importance of highlights, and then being able, the highlights become portable, because I find I like to write, and I have a sensory perception that a book holds something which is relevant for where I find myself in what I'm writing. And so I can just drop it down, find it, turn it into my words, and boom, we're off to kind of gonzo finance, and we're drinking tequila, and we're in the tropics sort of thing. But I have no Bloomberg. I have no kind of conscious outreach for financial material. And yet I don't know if it's the Wi-Fi, but there's just something out there that keeps kind of coming through and getting processed by my mind. Maybe I'm a shaman, you know, I'm ashamed to say that, but maybe I'm a shaman of some sort.
Well, my recent reads are have left quite an impression. I read Peter Zeihan's The End of the World is Just Beginning, and then I also read Matthew Ball's Metaverse. And it's striking because The End of the World is Just Beginning paints a rather bleak picture. It's informed by geopolitics and demographics, and it makes an argument for an end of globalization. It, like you, is very pessimistic on Europe in particular. But it paints a pretty stark picture for 2025 through 2035. And then by contrast, the metaverse is about our technological future, where the internet and the metaverse ultimately is becoming a more and more pleasant place to spend time, more and more appealing. And it looks like sci-fi dystopia, right? It looks like we will go that way, where the world of real things is more and more challenging, and the virtual world is more and more appealing. I also find myself wondering whether part of that is based on the fact that we are a dopamine-driven culture, and we do like the stimulation of the machines, and we don't like the complexity of the real things. And it seems inevitable almost that we'll be spending more and more of our energies in the short attention span, high dopamine technology world. and less confronting real things. And I was also, as I was reading the metaverse, I was thinking about the COVID experience, and I was reflecting on, like, economically, in terms of economic policy markets, what did we learn from the COVID experience? Well, we learned that people actually kind of enjoy being in their bubble and being on the internet and working their brains into a frenzy, right? With whatever their dopamine of choice, with NFT or stock trading or what have you, right? They don't really mind that existence so much. And then we learned that fiscal policy was far more important than monetary policy in a way, or at least the combination of the two is what's required to get things going really crazy. And I think it previews a future where we had the COVID excuse for printing a lot of money and restructuring the economy. And the experience suggests that we're going to come up with many more excuses to do the same thing. And we're going to get different forms of the craziness that we saw in COVID.
I wrote a paper in March 2020. So, the emergence, I wrote it in the summer of 2020, entitled the dawn of chaos. I think we certainly have opened a new chapter, which does seem chaotic, less organized. That in itself is not good for risk markets. Risk markets, we've just perhaps completed 1980 until, let's call it COVID, was perhaps a long stretch of time, which was the reimposition of order. That the things that happened, we could look upon it from afar and judge it to be the right steps. The 70s was very much disorder and chaos, and of course the many references to the 70s today, and it will require a retuning of our minds, because we've had 40 years of being accustomed to a particular metaverse, if you will. And I, the metaverse, I got that book. I found it hard to slip inside. I think for me, I'm a romantic. I need romantic verse. I mean, you met
it is very dry.
It's dry, yeah. I'm going to push a little bit back on the. I hope I'm not a perpetual pessimist. I'm sure I'm not. My next hat is going to say joy is our energy. Very much joy is our energy. Your other book, The End of the World, I've had so much wisdom the last few weeks listening to U2's Achtung Baby album from a while back, and there's a song there till it's the end of the world. I was on Asian CNBC last weekend or whatever, and I found myself saying, these markets wear my wealth like a see-through dress. I don't know if it's fear or desire. I'm sure complacency could take us higher, but I'm fearful, of what happens next. For me, I need soft, creative. I need music. I run barefoot in these beautiful sands here, and I come away and I feel enlightened. But the metaverse thing, I think they're onto a winner with that. I mean, I don't necessarily want to say Facebook and Zuckerberg and all of that stuff, but it touches on who we are, the basic tenets. Same with the surprise, which cuts across social and wealth factors, is that we all have a profound sense of belonging. Podcasts are so successful because too many of us are lonely. We're kind of tapping in to someone like to friends on Wi-Fi, if you will. And so metaverse, I think, captures that. And I think it also reflects just how unattainable a lot of our life has become. And again, perhaps owing to policy errors or just because life sometimes takes a turn for the worse. But the major thing that society has to deal with is that in 2009, there was the distinct possibility that equity markets could effectively reprice to zero. In March 2009, Citigroup was trading at $9, which was the same prevailing prices as 1976. Again, back into the chapter of chaos. And $9 was an overstatement because it was bust. Technically it should have been trading at zero, but nine was where we found it. And that's where the policymakers took their stance. And I wouldn't disagree with it. I think if we'd reset to zero, we saw that in the early 1930s with the bankruptcy of the entire financial system. And so I think wise heads prevailed. But the nasty social aspect of that is that it wasn't the Fed that bailed out the markets. It was the entirety, it was you and me, it was all the citizens of the world. But let's make it US centric. It was all US citizens. And that meant that you had US citizens that I call them the disenfranchised, either a function of age or serendipity has meant that they do not own assets. And they were called upon or prevailed upon to bail out those who do own assets. And here we are so many years later, and that distinction has just become even more stark. And we fear that at some point again, the disenfranchised might be called upon to bail things out again. And I'm not, so if I wish to be pessimistic, I'm not quite sure people will be satisfied or willing to take that same course of action. So the future is always fraught with uncertainty. But if I put on my happy face, I am optimistic. Where we find ourselves, you mentioned COVID and what we learned. We learned the subtleties of language, and we learned the subtleties of how much personal freedom we have versus, or we believe we have versus how much we actually have. And there was language that you could not use on social media platforms. You would be closed in. You would be subject to retribution. And something like that exists in the economic world, whereby I don't know why, but all the world's principal financial newspapers and other platforms are not willing to use this word depression. The depression has been consigned to the past. It's something that you associate with grainy black and white images from a long time ago, almost 100 years ago. But I tell you, it's here today with us. And just technically, a depression is when the economy recovers, but it never quite captures where you would have anticipated growth to be if you transported yourself to the year 2000. And with all of the available information, if you looked ahead and you were to guess at American GDP today, your figure would be, so US GDP is what? Is about $22 trillion, let's say, roughly. You would have guessed it to be 27, 28 trillion. That's a huge difference. And that's a difference each year. And that's the depression. That's the wealth, that's the broken dreams, that's the lack of income uplift, that's the difficulty in sending your kids to school, that's the difficulty with healthcare bills, etc. And that's a depression. Now, from a positive perspective, we've only had 4 of these damn things in 200 years. And I am optimistic that, again, we will prevail. We will have solutions. The solutions they're not quite available yet. I can kind of guess and push and have a sense of them, but I'm sure we will find a solution. The pessimists would tell you that this is when Marx has his day, that this is the permanent plateau in prosperity. And China's a little bit going that way, where it's kind of saying, we've been kind of making the numbers up. Actually, why don't we just say permanent plateau, and let's, rip off the costumes and just reveal ourselves again to be a redistributionists. And time will tell.
I thought perhaps you were hinting at the recent downtick, because I I do think it's an interesting debate. I think that, to one reading, the downtick that we experienced in Q1 and Q2 of 2022 is one of the most intense downticks of all times in real GDP activity. So I could see arguments for classifying that as a depression. It doesn't show up in employment. It hasn't really showed up in asset prices. But the inflation adjusted GDP numbers, the decline that occurred in Q1 and Q2, coming off the very hot 2021, was arguably one of the worst declines of all times. Now, it's coming off a very artificial high, but it's very stark. And my case for that basically relies on some of the recent Larry Summers work. He's been doing a deep dive in inflation. He's been writing a lot about it. He's been largely correct in the post-COVID environment. He came out with a paper in April that didn't get a lot of attention, but he said that a lot of the historical thinking about inflation is wrong, and the historical memory is distorted by the fact that the way that we calculate CPI has changed, right? And he attempts to rectify this by applying a consistent methodology to CPI and showing what the CPI would be over the past 40 years, 50 years, if you had applied a consistent methodology. There's none of this like John Williams shadow stats. Let's change dramatically the assumptions of GDP. There's none of this sort of stuff. It's just Larry Summers saying, let's use the exact same methodology and get a data series for the last 50 years. And what's surprising about his data series is that when you calculate the CPI in this way, the changes that we had in Q1 and Q2 were as large as the biggest inflation prints of the late 70s and early 80s, which is shocking, right? Like, it's totally shocking, because the way most people think about it is they just look up historical inflation rates and they just see that the monthly prints in the early 80s and late 70s were still significantly above the nines that we printed in the first half. And so they say, oh, well, at least we're not there. But Summers data suggests we actually are there. And it also suggests that the real GDP decline that we had in Q1 and Q2 might have been historic. Now, it was coming off a 2021 that was just so obviously unsustainable that it's not even worth reading too much into the decline from those levels. But it was a very big negative change in Q1 and Q2.
I love that you bring that up, and let's see we can kind of push it back and forward between us. I'm not your regular finance guy. I managed a global macro hedge fund for 15 years. If it had distinction, and I don't know if it had distinction, people always want to measure you, we get measured via beauty, via height, via width, via intellect, via numbers. Yeah. If there was a number for me, I was just odd. Right. Yeah, I think we kind of touched upon it. Here I am in this tiny island, and yet somehow via Wi-Fi waves and stuff, I want to push back against the great Larry Summers. I made a career, and my USP was, I sat there and I said to myself, wow, I've got to do a hedge fund, right? And this was, this is going back to 2002. And my competition are the smartest people, some of the smartest people, some of the smartest people in the world. I say that because back then, the remuneration, the 2% plus the 20% of profits meant that when you were right, you were really right. We've seen over again, I think you described the economic recovery of 21 has been preposterously high. And of course, the stock market's reaction was preposterously fantastic. And you had hedge fund managers earning $4 or $5 billion. All right. So when you have that form of remuneration, it would be logical to assume, not necessarily factual, but logical to assume that they are amongst the smartest people on the planet. So I concluded that it would really be not in my best interest to try and outsmart the smartest people. And instead, I try to answer the puzzle. Why is it that really, really smart people are just not guaranteed to make money in the crazy casino of gambling in the stock market and other risk markets? So for me, disdain is too much of a word, but I push against experts. Larry being one of them. The financial press is you've got to have credentials to be quoted. People don't come saying, "Hey, where's that shaman in St Barts?" We're in a time like we're suggesting we're opening up this dawn of chaos. This is a time when you kind of want to speak to the kind of the more fringe, crazier elements of the community because sometimes they actually have the insight and they can just get a glimpse of what happens next. Now, the astonishing thing about the two first quarters of this year is that the economy contracted, yeah, and two consecutive quarters of negative prints is a recession. And up until about 3 weeks ago, that wasn't a controversial thing to say, okay? Except the Federal Reserve and Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, had been out saying, it's not a recession. And it's like, well, hold on a second. We had two consecutive negative declines. Okay. And like, no. Yes, but no. It's not a recession because, hey, listen, unemployment, it keeps falling. People are spending the summer that was suspended in 21 in Vegas, they're spending now. Trust is it's okay. And so it feels like we live in this world of either imagined or invented realities, or like the metaverse is coming more and more to the fore, where the Federal Reserve, I believe, largely is the culprit in all of this, and its special force has been propaganda. It's the Wizard of Oz. That if you could actually, there's only 5 people in the world who understand money. Literally, I mean, all these hedge fund guys, the treasury of all these central bankers, they don't. Let me tell you a story. Back in 2003, I made 50% for my hedge fund. I'm not gloating. There were very, very few years when I made 50, but it was the first year, so it was quite precious. And I made it because I was buying gold, and I was buying it from central banks, largely the Bank of England. And the Bank of England was staffed by the most profoundly, prestigiously intelligent people on earth, PhDs, etc. And they had well-reasoned logic governing their decision. Me, I'd been to Milan. I bought myself a kind of silver Prada suit. I'd been disco dancing in the clubs of Milan. That night, when I went to sleep, I dreamt of the Wizard of Oz. And when I woke up the next morning, I just knew I had to buy gold. Okay. And who was right? You see how life kind of sometimes it's the crazier factions, but there is a conceit and an arrogance of a well-formed argument. And that's the trap that you have with experts. So again, I've said too much.
Looking at policy specifically in the COVID environment, what do you see as the key policy mistakes? If you take us back to your March 2020 article, The Dawn of Chaos, what do you think we can say with the benefit of retrospect were the major policy errors that occurred in 2020 and 21?
The power of the Federal Reserve is rhetoric. that it wants you to believe that it's omnipotent. Um, and really, since the 1960s, the Federal Reserve has had very little power in terms of the plumbing of the credit system. Starting as far back as the 60s, private commercial banks, not central banks, but private commercial banks, who are actually the only ones who are responsible for money printing, they reorganized their affairs and they created a club-like system called the euro dollar, whereby you could create dollars outside the sphere of America. This was a new thing. And the risk of your counterparties were other banks. And rather than having central bank regulations determining your risk levels, you had your peers. If your peers, other banks, were willing to accept your collateral, then you were fine. And so we invented a new form of money, which essentially took the government or the feds out of money. And ever since, the feds just had rhetoric that is like, we got this, we understand it. And it's a litany of errors. Now, specifically to your point, the Federal Reserve, the sin of the Federal Reserve, I believe, was Jay Powell and others going on daytime TV in the summer of 2020 and saying, we, the Federal Reserve, we print money. We print money. Now, legally, under the Federal Reserve Act of 1934 or 36, that's illegal. Okay, so they have no permission to print money, and indeed they cannot. But in trying to influence opinion, like, hey, don't worry, we got your back. We're printing money. We got this alien body snatching invasion. We will prevail. Okay, we're doing something. They were doing nothing. Now, coming out of that, remember, COVID was analogous to a world war, whereby in a world war you redirect all the manufacturing and industrial activity, all the shipping lanes, and everything is reorganized for the war effort. And in 2020, 21, and still today in 22 in China, it was kind of closed down. We said to people, stay at home, this thing's infectious. And so we for the first time ever, we closed the industrial capacity of the world. And then we reopened it. And we didn't just reopen, because you got to be cautious, you got to give them advance warning. Like, you might want to turn the electricity on, you might want to get some cleaning team in, get the dust off the machines, get ready. We didn't do any of that. The government, so back to fiscal policy, the government went, hey, here's a check from Uncle Sam. Go and spend money, right? And at that point, the largest component of spending is typically on services, eating out, going to the cinema, getting your hair cut, etc. That was all closed. But here's this money, and so you go on Amazon and you buy stuff, and boom, right? The guy who's just kind of opening the shutters and the gates on his factory, suddenly he's never been busy, and he's like, oh my God, right? And so you raise prices because demand's too much, and that's how we work. Like, I'm overwhelmed with demand, I'm going to raise my prices to choke it. And then you get to Larry going, first quarter, second quarter. And then indeed, the reality of these prints being enormous. Suddenly prices are rising at 9-10%, the fastest rate of price erosion or wealth erosion in 50 years. So the error is, I think the price increases that we're seeing are relative price increases. I think they are explainable by this preposterous situation that I tried to describe. I think it has precedent. The same thing happened after the Second World War. US prices were rising at 19% in 1948, 1949. But we don't talk about the great inflation from that period, because it was just an initial kind of changing the gears and getting back into it. But back to the Fed, because they were out there and, liar, liar, pants on fire, we're printing money. Well, you know what? You own the inflation now. It's yours, because you just told us you print money. And then 1 year later, prices are hitting the roof, you own it, my friend. And so what are they doing? They're raising interest rates. And they're bringing damnation because, again, they're just covering their backs. Uncle Joe Biden is out there going, how am I going to get reelected? What are you guys doing? You do something about it. And it's, again, when bureaucrats and those in power just seek to for them to prevail, for them to protect themselves, and they try and bring all of the rest of us down, I get angry. So that's what I think was the errors of the last few years.
I recently read $1 Trillion Triage, the Nick Tamaros account of COVID era policy, and it was remarkable to me how manic the March period was in particular. I feel like you can point to the last week in March as being an unnecessary amount of market intervention. Some of the last things that happened, buying or not so much the reality, but the announcement that they would be buying some junk bond ETFs, and some of the last measures after the market had already made a strong recovery seemed excessive. And it was clear that they just had in mind that they were going to do much more than was necessary. And I also think Mnuchin was quite active in pushing. At that time, there were 5 to 10 calls a day between Powell and Mnuchin. And then I think the next error was talking in 2021 as if inflation was inconceivable. And I think the major error was, if you're looking from the perspective of March 1 to now, where we've added $1.5 trillion or so to the Fed balance sheet, it was evident by March 1, 2021, that the economy had made a strong recovery, that asset markets were richly valued, and that prices were likely to be going up. So that time, a little bit early, should have been the moment to slow down the stimulus. And instead, it was a lot of stimulus and a lot of confident talk until the inflation numbers came hot and heavy.
You name checked another book, and your credentials are impeccable. You are a well-read host. I congratulate you. But again, I want to push back and off you. I'm looking at my Kindle on my phone. I'm like, what have I been reading? So I'm presently reading. I'm reading. What is it? The Memoirs of an Addicted Brain, which is fantastic, I have to say. I mean, it's really, really good. I always go back and read Ayn Rand, and Atlas Shrugged is with us today. I'm reading a book by, God knows, but the thought of the heart and the soul of the world. Why is it always about you? I mean, I've got issues. I'm reading the memoirs of Chris Black, Island Records. Discovered Bob Marley, U2, wonderful memoir. I'm reading about Led Zeppelin and Hunter S. Thompson. And in the last 3 months, I actually read The Wizard of Oz. So I'll have to take my hat off to your credentials, but the world that you describe is, understandably, given my source of material, not one that I understand. So the Federal Reserve gunning its balance sheet, additionally in the year 2021, is irritating because in 2020, we had no record. There's no data points for COVID, and how long it could last and how damaging it could be. But 1 year later, we had the measure of it. Again, we had this wonderful, creative, democratic, liberal social democracy, and it found solutions. It found, it found a way out. And so we knew that the recession was V, and it would be sharp in the rebound. And yes, there's a complaint that the Federal Reserve, even with that knowledge, prevailed and gunned its balance sheet, I think, by another $2 trillion, so 10% of GDP. And that feels wrong. Except we're talking about laundromat tokens, right? They were creating excessive bank reserves. Now, you can't go to Starbucks with a whole swag of banking reserves and say, I swap you this for a coffee. They say, get out of here, you're a joker, right? Okay. The Fed's a joker, right? They were not printing money. Okay. Who prints money? Private sector banks. Okay. Let's look at private sector banks. Credit cards. We all have credit cards. We all spend too much on our credit cards in Vegas and St Barts and elsewhere, right? Credit card balances are 9% below where they were in 2019. But when you read about, well, the Fed's created all of this money, which it hasn't, right? And when you see the price of everything exploding, you think, well, wow, there's so much money printing. This is serious. It's an illusion. There are only 5 people in the world who understand money, and none of them works for the Federal Reserve, sadly.
Going forward, do you think that they have the power to restrain, right? There's always the difficulty of pushing on a string, of stimulating the economy, but pulling the string, we think, is something that the Fed can do. Would you agree with the idea that the Fed can slow the economy dramatically, and do you think they are going to have the will to do that?
The Fed is like an old drunk uncle at a wedding insisting on doing some John Travolta dancing. You just wish they weren't doing it, you know. We can function very well, the financial markets, and the financial markets acting as either a lubricant or a brake on our social democracy, on saying, hey, look, we've gone a little bit too far, or hey, come on, take more, try harder. We can do that without the Federal Reserve. When I look back at Federal Reserve interventions, I just see errors. We're in a depression, I would say to you, because the economy peaked in 2007, but you go 5 years out to 2013, and the Federal Reserve is going, oh, we have a problem. We're worried about inflation. You had this thing called a taper tantrum, where they started having second thoughts about their quantitative easing, and that they were going to unwind it. Now, pause for a second, because adult unemployment was 7.8%. 5 years after 2000, 6 years after 2007, the economy had only expanded by about 10%. Now, over 6 years, it's really nothing. And yet these goons are like, whoa, panic. And the 10-year, with their manic personality, they persuaded the markets to push the 10-year rate to 3%. That's an interest rate hike. And guess what? The economy slowed down. So they made an error. They slowed an economy which was struggling. And they shouted fire, and it was the wrong call. And then they said nothing, they did nothing. And then you get to kind of late 2015, and Janet is Federal Reserve chairwoman. And she was kind of cautious, but she's kind of starting again. She actually raises rates, but modestly. And then she gets replaced by Jay. And Jay has this, Jay wants to leave his mark. He's envious of Paul Volcker. He's like, damn, that Texan guy, all I read about is Paul Volcker. I'm going to be the next Paul Volcker. And reputations are contextual. And Jay comes in and he starts hiking rates, and he's, hell and brimstone, and we got to slow this thing down. What have we got to slow down? We got to slow an economy which should be like $5 trillion greater every year than it is. And these Muppets are trying to, what are they trying? When they say slow things down, They're trying to destroy jobs. Okay. So, and the stock market falls 20% because the market's like, oh my God, what are you doing? And at the same time, drilling for energy, like hydrocarbons, getting them out of the earth, and the great reserves that reside in North America. It's a risky business, and it's funded by high yield debt. And when Jay's raising rates and threatening hell and brimstone, guess what happens to high yield credit? It collapses. You financed a fracking operation, and you bought the bonds. They probably trade like 97 cents on the dollar. When Jay's finished with you, you're selling them for 27 cents on the dollar. And you fast forward to today, and here we are with this profound shortage of energy, and we got very high prices. And what is the response from North American explorers and wildcat and interesting people? They're like, the last thing I'm going to do is explore and get more precious hydrocarbons out of the earth because the capital markets will kill me. Why will the capital markets kill me? Because the blinking Federal Reserve every 3 or 4 years goes, fire, fire, oh, fire. Like the correct response would be to fire the Federal Reserve.
Europe, you say, has problems more terminal in your opinion than the United States. What is your assessment of Europe at the moment?
I was on the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, I think in 2010, and the ex-Prime Minister of Denmark, he was kind of saying, "You, Mr. Hendry, your days are over. We have you. We're going to take you out." Well, guy's a bum. Okay, guy's an idiot. He's part of the generation that sold the future of Europe, down the toilet. As the principal priority for a sovereign nation is to secure energy. I mean, I had a croissant this morning. Hey, listen, it's a French culture. A croissant probably has 300 calories. Now, if you've been on one of those elliptical bike things and you can put a target time, or you put in calories and give yourself like 15 minutes to burn 300 calories, you gotta work like crazy, yeah, to create that energy, right? So again, joy is our energy. Energy is profoundly important. It's profoundly important for establishing sovereignty. And Europe rejected shale exploration. It embraced the environmental social governance that, not only were we to be mindful of the planet, but we had to immediately stop all exploitation and discovery in the European continent. Yeah. And Europe has it has no indigenous domestic liberty energy, if you will. It is dependent on an energy source that comes from a government that doesn't respect liberty. So the euro presently is trading pari passu with the dollar. And I would imagine that the euro has to weaken further to reflect its lack of sovereignty. And to put that in stark language, there's a gas crisis because of the escalation in tragic events with Russia and Ukraine. If you put it into price per barrel, because we all know the price of a barrel, well, you see it in the corner of your television when you watch a news channel, and it will say today that crude oil is about $90. Yeah. The equivalent price for that gas in Europe today is close to $600. Right? That's the problem of Europe. How can you survive at $600 per barrel of oil? And again, it throws light on America may have its problems, but it has almost an infinite supply, certainly of natural gas. And it has other issues. Again, back to that environmental social governance. The US is just all potential, but we're in the age or the dawn of chaos. My principal point back in 2020 was that we can cite Milton Friedman, the noted, esteemed monetarist economist, and he made this very um, evident after the event sort of thing that money is or inflation is a monetary event. Like without money, you kind of don't get inflation. And I wanted to add on top of that, it's also psychological. Like it's the two factors moving in unison, which create the inflation. Paul Volcker's great achievement was actually psychological. Think of a bank as a hedge fund. They can either have a loan to a mom and pop business, to a risky commercial private enterprise in the United States. And think of that as being like a real asset because you can increase the interest rate. And if you have inflation, then your credit risk is less because your companies can raise prices. Or the bank can buy government bonds. And when Volcker came in, um, they didn't want to touch bonds because there was inflation. And Volcker came in and it's like a poker table and he sits there and he's like, guys, I'm calling you. Like, so you own basically your portfolio is loans to private enterprises in America. And we're in a recession because the Arab embargo again and the price of oil gone from $10 to 40. And the last time that happened 6 years ago, the economy slam dunked into a dungeon of despair. Guess what? I'm going to raise rates. And actually, hold on a second. On a Saturday, he actually went boom, press the button, and he raised rates, not by these 25 basis. Today we're the great alarm of 75. On a Saturday morning, he raised rates by 100 basis points. He's like, are you listening? And the banks are looking at their, poker and they're looking at their deck and they're like, you're bluffing. So he did it again. And he did it again. And the banks went, holy Moses, this guy is bonkers. And we better sell these things and move the other way. And that created the legend of Volcker. It's psychology. The Fed does not do money, it does psychology.
Okay, during the depths of COVID, they were buying $80 billion of treasuries a day. They do have that power, right? To print some money and have the Bank of New York, the Federal Reserve Branch in New York buy a lot of treasuries like that. It does seem like they have the power to, at least in the short term, have some sharp market impacts.
It would be a sharp market impact. So the role of a central bank historically goes back to this definition from a Victorian British economist, Walter Bagehot, and it's to be the lender of last resort, to buy the stuff that no one else is willing to do. JP Morgan did it in 1907 or whatever, before the US had a Federal Reserve. So my pushback on that statement is since 2008, or since March 2009 and the advent of quantitative easing, which is largely buying US Treasury bonds, the Federal Reserve has been in competition with every other major financial savings institution in buying government bonds. They're buying the same thing. In fact, there was meetings from a Federal Reserve meeting about 8 years ago saying, we're meant to buy the stuff that no one wants to buy. Why are we buying what everyone wants to buy? So again, let me try and put that in psychological context. The banks messed up horribly in 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007. And why did they mess up? They messed up owing to the arrogance and the conceit of a well-formed argument. It was a great argument. Lend money to mortgages and then package them, take a mortgage from each district of each state of the United States, and then sell it on. And impeccable logic, because up until that point, we had never, in the continent of the United States, we had never seen a unified price decline across every state at the same moment in time. Never happened. The US is magnificently diversified via resources and intellect and culture and everything else. Okay. That was the conceit and the arrogance of a very well-formed argument. Except the argument failed because prices fell across every state. And owing to that, like I say, Citigroup in March 2009 was trading at 9, but really it should be trading at 0 because it was bankrupt. And banks are like elephants. They've got long memories. They're like, we ain't doing that crazy shit again, you know? And banks have just not been extending credit. Banks are terrified. The last thing they want to do, if you're Johnson and Johnson, if you are Apple, no problem. You want $1 trillion? I'll wire it this morning. Okay. But you know, if it's Hugh in St Barts and I'm thinking about building another property, like, get out of here. Go away. Ask someone else. Okay. So, but they have to do something. Remember, they can either make loans or they can buy government bonds. And for 15 years, they're desperate to buy government bonds. And at the Fed minutes, one of the Fed president went, why are we buying what everyone else wants to buy? Do you have that answer?
I don't, but I think that the Fed has to be doing a lot of the buying because the supply is determined by Congress essentially running large deficits, and the banking system does not have the ability to, over long periods of time, take on all that debt. Over short periods of time, it can, but over the long periods of time, it doesn't work. The treasury market doesn't function if the Fed's not doing a lot of the buying. I think it did function pre-financial crisis because the patchwork of our international trading and financial system, it seemed unsustainable, but it was working for a while to have the partners that ran big surpluses against us take on most of the debt. And then that has broken down in the past decade or so. And so I don't see an alternative to having the Fed take most of it on.
Pushing the private sector, they say, go away. We want to buy this. And the private banks say, no, go away. We want to buy it. Stop. You keep pushing the price up. Go away. It's the crazy uncle dancing drunk at the wedding party. Now, you hit again against another. And again, it's why I push back on Larry Summers. Tenured professorship is so damn hard to penalize experts when there's no penalty when they're wrong. They last forever. It's perpetual tenure. Okay. Whereas for me, you know, if I was wrong, I'd get fired. You take your money out, boom, go away. You're a joker. You know, so I've had that kind of dagger pointed at me. Where's that dagger today? You know, I've got about, you know, you probably think I'm the super rich hedge fund manager. I've got a ton of debt locked in at 2%, 20 years, fixed. And I'm building these. And basically, St. Barts property is like Bitcoin, you know. The building regulations, it's effectively like a halving, like the supply is being reduced every year. And every year, some new Tom, Dick, and Harry is becoming rich. And they want to come to a place like St. Barts and peacock and say, hey, look at me. I've had a good year. So that's, you know, that's my sharp pencil is dealing with the debt. Now, you hit upon another source of propaganda, which is the real culprit of where we are and how we could change things, I believe. And it's this notion of somehow China back 10 years ago kind of helping the home team and buying treasuries. Okay. That ain't, and you do correctly note that over the past 8 years or so, their absolute holdings, and we have to guess because they hide it, but we can guess, their absolute holdings of US treasuries have declined. And so again, with rhetoric, you could say, wow, you know, because we're out of control and they're getting a little bit concerned and now we got inflation. They're Chinese, they're smart, you know. BS, complete BS, right? This is the true thing. And Larry's wrong. Inflation in America, take any starting point, but you know, 1980 would be obviously very favorable. But go before 1980. Inflation in every category where the government is not involved has consistently fallen and fallen dramatically. Okay, that's just a fact. Okay, and it's a fact not because of Volcker, but it's a fact because of what I want to call a trade war which is a class war which is camouflaged as a trade war. That for noble reasons, America and the West, but principally led by the United States, accepted that we had to do something about the Chinese. There's a lot of them. They're a bit cranky. They're prone to communism. They're prone to purging their population. They just seem to extol in bad things. What if we could engage with them commercially? What if we could make them richer? For sure, at the beginning, it would be tough on us because our unskilled labor pool would be affected by bringing on 1.4 billion Chinese peasants. And that's the class warfare, that wages would come down. And that's why inflation across all tradable goods sectors has just universally fallen, except in those areas like education, healthcare, and even stock markets where the government, fingerprint is all over it. 30 years of trade class warfare, where if you're not rich, you just got poorer and poorer and poorer. And now you've got the blinking Federal Reserve hiking rates because of its silly rhetoric in 2020, and incorrectly, in my opinion, not recognizing that these high relative prices, they're not inflation. Inflation is a monetary phenomenon, and credit card balances are 9% below where they were in 2019. And if I was to give you the whole gamut of financial data, you would see the last thing banks want to do is print money. So who's suffering? Right. I'm in St Barts when my clients arrive. Okay, it's 90 degrees, it's 75% humidity. What are the two complaints? The air conditioning is not cool enough, which is bogus. The rooms get cool to 17 degrees. And then they step out and the swimming pool is not hot enough, which is bogus because I've got the heating jacked up. Okay. So clearly the rich are unaffected and clearly their asset prices are high. Okay. Whereas in the real world, everyone's been told, hey, what do you do? Do you drive less? Do you trade down at the supermarket? Do you give up on all luxuries? Walmart's the only answer. Do you give up on Netflix? It's two different worlds. People are getting damn angry, and quite rightly so. And the political universe presently is not offering solutions. I mean, Trump was a reflection of the anger, but not a solution. And the question is, well, what's the next attempt? Because there will be another attempt.
We agree on that. Politics always trumps the economics, and it seems like the politics are in line to be powerful. I think we'll likely lurch back and forth, left and right, and probably have some extreme policy coming our way in the next decade or so. And right now, it's been a news heavy cycle with Trump and all of that. And I thought it was quite predictable that there would be a takedown and he would not survive reputationally to run again. It seems like that will be the case. He's going to probably enter a painful period of depositions and discovery and all of that almost can't go well.
But his secret sauce is the trade class warfare and this blind bat that we call the Federal Reserve flapping around and trying to control the world by making the constituency of Trump voters, making their life even more miserable. And no one gets it. This is why one of my favorite investment books is Albert Camus, L'Étranger, the Stranger. God is dead. Sorry, I know like you Americans have a hang up on that, but the big man, he's dead. There are no rules and you're on your own. Like, get angry. Like, I wear another hat that says, I recommend you panic. Think of the conditioning. They will not allow us to use the word depression. They're now jacking up this nonsense that we've got out of control inflation when the banks are not really lending money. Okay. They're denying 2 consecutive quarters is a recession. I mean, incredible. And their buddies in the Wall Street Journal and Financial Times are saying, yeah, well, they raise a good point. What point? It's nonsense. So, and when, you'll be closer to it than I, but when you look ahead, I mean, I don't see anyone. I, I don't see truth tellers. The problem is, I'm presenting Jesus and everyone's denying God. Like you don't want to hear, you only get some sense of another imagined reality by tuning in to some bloke in St Barts who's building villas. I'm charging $60,000 low season for a week, and people can't afford to put $60 of gas in their tank. And yet I actually know the solutions. I would put a withholding tax. Like, so you're fearful that the Chinese ain't going to buy those US government bonds? Baloney. Baloney. In fact, I would charge them a damn rent. I would say, you want to pimp a ride on our majestic system? I'm going to charge you. I'm going to charge you 3% a year. Okay. I tell you, they will not sell. Because you think of what is their option? What are their options? They say, in disgust, you Americans, you break all the rules, we're going to take down Taiwan, sort of thing, right? So they sell them. What do? They park them in renminbi. The renminbi goes to my level, 4.5. Not going to happen. That's their number one priority, is not to allow that to happen. So charge them. Let's get politicians that actually, that's a hard thing, that understand money, that are being actually well advised. They say to their constituency, let's stop the class warfare. Let's stop the warfare on your communities. Like that. We can do it. The withholding tax. And then we're going to raise a lot of money. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a sovereign wealth fund. Not for everyone. We're going to create a sovereign wealth fund for the disenfranchised members of our community. If you don't own assets in America today, quite frankly, that's a crime on us. And we will be called upon to bail out the asset holders at some point. If the S&P loses 25% from today's level, Federal Reserve will crank up the rhetoric and will intervene in markets. Okay. At that point, you use the sovereign wealth fund, you buy assets, and you're buying those assets for an account, which is for all the folk that are disenfranchised. And so suddenly everyone is together, rather than this kind of fracturing of society where I hate you, you hate me.
I'm wondering what Euro breakup looks like if it ever comes to that. We're in a summer where Italy is probably as fashionable as it's ever been, right? It's all over Instagram, right? Like, I can't imagine what the rates are. It's as fashionable as ever. It could survive on tourism alone, on lifestyle, right? Does there ever come a day, or are we close to a day where Italy or Spain or Greece or some combination says we're better off going it alone, doing it the old way? And what does that look like?
It's not Italy or Spain saying we're better off doing it another way. It's the Northern Protestants saying it wasn't it for me. It's the return of the prodigal son. The younger son's been plowing diligently, doing all the sensible things, and the young crazy one went to Vegas, went crazy on the white powder, spent it all. And now he's back, and his father's hugging him. He's like, "Oh, welcome back." And the older brother's like, "I feel like an idiot," right? And so that's not there yet, but there's been a pivot this summer so that the higher rates have got in the way of the European Central Bank. So Italy has a lot of debt, and if you can control how much interest, if you pay nothing on the interest, then there's no limit on the amount of debt you can have outstanding. In theory, yeah, which is the kind of European quantitative easing program. They have a lot of debt. We pray at some point they wisen up. They kind of do more sensible things with their political culture. We hope so. And in the meantime, we're going to just take the pressure out of the system by keeping interest rates very low. And then you have, obviously, starting this year, you've had this huge surge in in commodity and energy prices. And you've had a fracturing in interest rates. It's like you get one leak, you put your hand on it, and then you get, oh my God, there's another leak. But the leaks are Italy. And so they've said, hey, listen, we're going to, like the Fed, we're worried about inflation because we're blind, because we're not one of the 5 people that understands money. We're going to increase interest rates, and we're going to stop buying government bonds. We promise. Except we're going to keep buying Italian government bonds. So la dolce vita, it like the summer is wonderful in the Mediterranean. Like you say, Instagram is replete with wonderful images. And everyone else is getting interest rates jacked up. They're no longer buying their government bonds. And everyone else's life is misery with these energy prices. Remember, $600 per barrel of oil equivalent. But the Italians have got a pass. And then to confuse matters even further, they've just kicked out Mario Draghi. Now, Mario Draghi is this technocrat who ran the European Central Bank. He's got a following in the financial markets, and he'd become the political leader, and he was running the government in Italy, and he's been turfed out. So what happens now if they bring another bozo in who just, why not ride the system? Just, well, and that's what Italians, I mean, I don't wish to be a cultural stereotype, but there's a kind of, screw it, use the system to your advantage until the system rejects you. So it's plausible. And again, the dawn of chaos is psychology, and it's anger, and anger is building, and it's building owing to the desperate nature of these price increases for items that we call non-discretionary. You have no choice. You got to feed your kids. You got to heat your house. You got to drive your car. You got to get to work, and it's leaving you with nothing. So not today, but it become, again, it's, well, if that has more and more credence, then you see the euro breaking the buck. You see it trading below pari passu at $1. That's telling you where we're sliding to. And so I wouldn't stand against the argument of like the euro trading in the 80s versus the dollar.
When you say you would stand against it,
I wouldn't stand against it. I could see that happen.
I see.
I could see that. Yeah, thank you for the clarification. Yeah.
My last question, your interest going forward, aside from St. Bart's life, you've hinted at the idea that you would like to engage in money management. You also are more engaged in the content space than ever before. I've noticed your Twitter follower count has ramped quite impressively. You're more active on the podcast, looks like a couple times a week. Started with Substack. What do you see for the next couple of years, and where can people find you on the content space?
I'm fed up with the experts. We're running out of time. Our society's getting angry. And that's why you'll find me on Hendry_Hugh on Twitter. And that's why we're putting out this acid capitalist. The life is so bad. I need hallucinogenic agents to keep out the gray. And it's funny the audience project. They project on. I'm sure you get this. And wise man told me, listen to the projection. Don't fight it. And people are miserable. People are lonely and they're miserable. And so the whole acid capitalist thing has taken stock. But I do a weekly podcast that we publish on the Asset Capitalist Show on the wonderful Apple podcast platform. I mean, the Apple is the S&P, Spotify maybe is the NASDAQ, et cetera, with all the others. We also put it out on YouTube under Hugh Hendry Official. And what we're trying to do there is I get to meet with amazing, inquisitive, fantastically insightful people. That's called the world of being a hedge fund. But you never get invited. The whole financial community is heads I win, tails I win. You remind me who you're again. Oh, you're the guy that's paying the bills. But you're the last person I think of. And so we do this weekly podcast. We say, hey, come in, sit, for the moment, listen, and then like hit us with questions, and we'll come back to you. So we're going to get out of this depression. We've got to better inform people. And I may be on a volcanic island, but with the wonders of the WWW, we can spread a message that let's get angry and let's change the system for the better. That's what I'm doing.
I thank you so much for your time. This was a lot of fun. Hopefully we'll do it again at some point in the future, and maybe I'll have a good year and come down to St. Barts.
You're not far away, and you'll always be welcome.